Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Abby Bloomfield and I am a junior at the college, a member of the Student Advisory Committee, and co-chair of the Institute of Politics Fellows and Study Groups program.
And my name is Shreya Panagrahi and I'm a senior at the college. I'm also a member of the Student Advisory Committee and co-chair of the Fellows and Study Groups program. Before we begin, please note the exit doors located on both the Park side and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park.
Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight by tweeting with the hashtag IOP Fellows Forum, which is also listed in your program.
Tonight's forum is an opportunity to hear perspectives from the Fall 2018 Institute of Politics Fellows on a variety of political issues and how they will address some of these issues in their study groups this semester. The discussion will be moderated by Director of the IOP, Mark Guerin.
Please join us in welcoming Mark to the stage.
Thank you, Abby and Shreya. Thank you very much. Thanks for your leadership with the Fellows Committee, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first forum here. We'll bring in our extraordinary group of resident and visiting fellows. Let's give it up. Well. Welcome. We're excited to have you all here, and we're really excited to have this group of resident fellows and visiting fellows, all of whom will be teaching study groups that we will get to certainly and have a chance to talk about that, talk about the news of the day. There's some news of the day here that I think we should, but also a chance to, as the description says, unpack some issues in American politics. And so we warmly welcome all of you to the Institute of Politics, particularly first-year students that are here that are getting a sense of the IOP, getting a sense of study groups, and what that might be, how you might think about doing that. This is an extraordinary time in civic life, and at the Institute of Politics is a variety of ways for you to engage in that. The forum, the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum, is one important way. And next week alone, we'll have 3 interesting speakers. Former Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, will be here in the forum, and in conversation with David Gergen. Professor Jill Lepore will be here talking about her new book on American history, moderated by Dan Baltz, our senior fellow and Washington Post political writer. And CNN's Don Lemon will be here talking about race and media and politics, moderated by our own Margaret Talev from Bloomberg and the past chair of the White House Correspondents Association. So that's just next week. So there's a lot going on and a lot of ways for you to be engaged. We're excited about the Harvard Votes Challenge, which is a university effort. The IOP is working very affirmatively in that regard. There are 10 schools here at Harvard that are engaged and others coming on board. There are folks in the back with t-shirts. If you have not registered to vote, as President Bacow said in his convocation address, the first homework assignment to first-year students was to get out your phones and register to vote through the IOP Turbo Vote project. And so it's a little bit easier right there in the back of the room, so we can make it easy for you. So we wanted to engage with our fellows. We want to have a chance for you to get to know them. They'll be here for the entire semester. There'll be opportunities in the study group, the office hours, and related events. The resident fellows live right here on campus. So for those of you in, I guess, down around Mather House, if it gets too loud, you can blame this crowd for their conduct. But hopefully you'll have a chance to get to know them. So let me just quickly introduce you, then we'll get into some conversation. Of course, the hallmark of the forum is a chance to get your questions. There's microphones here and up in the balconies, and we want to get to that in fast order. So let me just quickly go down the row here. We start with Amy Dacey, who is the past CEO of the Democratic National Committee and has a long history in Democratic politics. She was the executive director of Analyst. She worked on Capitol Hill, so she brings a wealth of experience in American politics, and she'll explain, but teaching an important study group on women in politics. Congressman Joe Heck from Nevada, was elected to office in the state Senate in Nevada and 3 terms in the Congress. He blends a background in elected office as well as military service. He is currently the chair of a National Commission on Military, Public, and National Service, reporting to the Congress on important issues. Brittany Packnett is here. She's Vice President of Teach for America. Long engagement as an activist and engaged from the Ferguson Commission, serving on the Commission for President Obama. Co-founder of Project Zero, and will be engaged in an important study group in and around social movements and change, and we'll hear more about that. Next to Brittany is the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, who completed his service in New Orleans. You're getting a little shout out there, Mitch. Long public service as lieutenant governor, and his family's, of course, legacy of service is well known from his father and sister and family members in Louisiana. So Mayor Landrieu will be here leading one of the 3 study groups with other former mayors, the mayors of Philadelphia, former Mayor Michael Nutter, in Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, and they will be here on campus leading an interesting study group on local politics and potholes and public service. So it's a good topic. John Noonan is next to the mayor. He has advised presidential candidates, Governor Romney and Governor Bush, Senator Cotton presently, on national security and military issues. And his expertise will be brought to bear in his study group. And finally, from Bloomberg News, who has covered campaigns in the White House, Margaret Talev. She is a CNN analyst. You've seen her all over the tube. She just had an important interview with President Trump and recently came off her service as president, as I said, of the White House Correspondents Association. So welcome, and join me in thanking all these fellows who will be with us this semester. So before we get specifically to the conversation of study groups, this is the Institute of Politics, so let's start with the news of the day, and I think many of us have been reflecting that this is a rather extraordinary time when you look at the past week or 10 days or so, from Senator McCain's funeral services and the tributes to the senator and the related stories, to Bob Woodward's book, Fear, that came out, detailing some of the conversations that he's had within the White House. And of course, yesterday's release of the anonymous op-ed talking about the quiet resistance within the Trump White House. So it is extraordinary times. And historians, presidential historians, Douglas Brinkley said there's nothing like this in American history. And others have reflected on that. I think, so just to get into this question of the moment in time, it would be interesting to get some reflections. And perhaps, Margaret, we could start with you, because on this stage you're perhaps the last person to have talked to the president in your interview last week. But as someone who knows the White House, as someone who has covered campaigns, how do you see this moment in time? And how did you reflect on the release of some of both the Woodward book, the New York Times piece, and how you see it from your perspective?
I mean, timing is everything, right? And if only I had had that interview this week, I would have had some new questions to ask him. But I think also we probably wouldn't have had that interview this week. The last week has been fairly extraordinary. And all of these things, the timing of all of these things is coincidental, but the fact that they have come together has turned it into a sort of a truly explosive event, right? I mean, Senator McCain's, Bob Woodward's book was already written and copies available before Senator McCain passed away. Senator McCain's services were extraordinary, not only because they were planned by Senator McCain for maximum impact, but also because of how many Republicans wanted to fulfill his wish in terms of how they participated. And then I read a little bit this afternoon about the story behind the New York Times decision to go ahead and publish anonymously. And the story that I saw said that they were approached by an intermediary for Anonymous before the release of the Woodward excerpts and the Post coverage. So it was sort of a coincidence of timing, but a pretty insane coincidence. And what we have now is a very unusual decision by an op-ed page of a major newspaper, but also very unusual behavior by a sitting American president that's been accumulating over some period of time and is going to come to a head, at least a head, during the midterm elections. And so I think you see the confluence of all of this. The definition of the Republican Party is at stake. Control of Congress is at stake. The direction of the second half of this term of the president is at stake. And Democrats are trying to figure out who's going to run in 2020. That is at stake. The control of the Supreme Court is at stake. A lot of things are happening at the same time. And they're happening against the backdrop of a president who behaves unpredictably and is seeking to define power, American power and leadership in a new way and on his own terms. And that sets the stage for where we are now.
Mayor Landrieu, you've been a successful chief executive. You've managed a political operation. How do you see the moment we're in, and how did you react to some of the stories this week?
Well, you know, I'm first of all, I'm thrilled to be with all of you, but as I look at all your spectacular faces, it strikes me that when Donald Trump, the candidate, manifests himself, we're now about 2.5 years into it. Some of you were sophomores in high school. And without speaking too much about where you happen to physically be in your life, this has occupied a large part of your life, and you might be lulled into thinking this is normal. This is not normal. In the 30 years that I've served in office and all the years my dad served in office, I've never experienced anything quite like this. Now, whether Doug Brinkley's right about whether there was another moment in history, I'll leave to the historians, but I want you to all to really understand this is not normal. We have not had a situation where a senator like Senator McCain, who was a revered Republican, he was a real Republican. He's a guy that I liked very much and respected, but didn't agree with all the time. Basically demonstrated in his life, but more importantly in his death, felt the need to demonstrate what the word greatness really looked like, although that as though that was somehow a debatable notion. And now we're actually debating what virtue and vice, what greatness looks like, what's big, what's small, what's strength, what's weakness. We've really never litigated these issues. They had actually been settled, and we in America were arguing in between the pretty safe boundaries of democracy and civil and constructive discourse. We are outside of those boundaries, and I think it's really important for you to understand that, because it's nice to know when you're walking next to the edge of a cliff so that you don't fall off. And I happen to think that we're actually we're there. Now, I mentioned, I think, to Dan a little bit earlier, I'm optimistic because I always believe in America we find a way to show up, course correct, and do the right thing, but it does not happen by accident, which really speaks to the seriousness with which I hope each of you think about what you're going to do in the next couple of years. Military service is one of the great ways to serve your country. Being involved in government is as well. And there are lots of ways for citizens to participate, but you have to engage, because democracy does not survive on its own. It survives as a result of the cumulative actions of all of us who speak our piece in a way where we actually purpose the outcome and the intent. And as an executive I was a lieutenant governor for 6 years, so I ran an executive office, and I was a mayor for 8. It is so extraordinarily unusual to have this kind of civil war within the organization that you run in order to give some level of clarity to the people that you govern, that it's almost hard to describe. And so as we talk about whether the New York Times should have done it, whether Anonymous should have, said who they were, the fact that it actually happened, that somebody on that level inside felt the need to speak in and of itself is so extraordinary that it actually should take a moment for us to think about. But it's happened so many times, it's almost now, some people say, well, what did you expect? And I don't want this for anybody to become normal. And I would like everybody to stay focused on how serious and how important it is for us to address it in a constructive and a thoughtful way.
So Congressman Heck, as an elected Republican to the Congress, a member of the Republican Congress when you're in the House and State Senate, Nevada, your reaction to this moment?
Yeah, it's hard to interpret, right? And I think we look at the outcome of the 2016 election with President Trump coming into office, and what we've seen over the ensuing almost 2 years, this crescendo effect that's taken place in Washington, D.C., and what does it portend for the upcoming midterms, right? And I think as was mentioned, John McCain was a real, seen as the real Republican. President Trump was more is a populist. So he ran on a populist message, not necessarily a Republican message. And what concerns me for the future is whether or not this is a turning of the Republican ship into something that it has not been in the past, right? Is this now the definition of the Republican Party? Personally, I align myself more with the John McCain wing of the party. And so it concerns me on what it portends for the future of the party, and certainly what it portends for the future in the elections coming up.
Well, staying with the news of the day, I guess another big piece of it was the Supreme Court hearings with Brett Kavanaugh. And Brittany, I'd be interested in your take as someone who's thought carefully about social movements and as an activist. Part of the unfolding has been the hearings themselves, right? What's happening, what Senate Democrats did today, what citizens are doing, yet set into this context of hearings that are pretty, we know kind of the basic play here, what each side is going to say. How do you react to the hearings, or what are you thinking about when you're watching the unfolding of that form of citizenship?
Well, first of all, it's really an honor to be here, and I'm excited to be here throughout the semester. First of all, I want to honor the fact that some of those several dozens of people who have been arrested in the last few days for engaging in their First Amendment right and making their voices heard in those hearings were friends of mine. People like Linda Sarsour and my friend Maisan, on that very first day, were clear that this conversation cannot go on without our voices being included, and that business as usual cannot be the name of the game when lives are at stake. And when we're talking about voting rights, when we're talking about Roe versus Wade, when we're talking about immigration, when we're talking about access to health care, it is not hyperbole to say that people's lives are at stake, because they are. And we've been speaking throughout the week as we've become oriented to Harvard. There have been lots of meetings and lunches, and hopefully we'll have some of this Pinocchio's pizza that I keep hearing about. But as we've been having these conversations, we've been having a conversation about participation. And one of the things that I find continuously inspiring about especially the generations represented here, but something that I think generations throughout time have realized is that participation can take many, many different forms and can manifest in different ways. And I appreciate that there's a conversation happening now where it's not simply about following the rules and how you participate then if the rules actually limit access, voice, and justice. And so I am not only glad to see the kind of very classic activism that we've seen when people are disrupting the hearings themselves, but I've also been glad to see a bit of fire under in the bellies rather of people like Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Mazie Hirono, who I guess were figuring out if the documents were approved to be released or not, but most certainly to say that the American people have a right to access all of this information. I feel like that spirit of protest, which we really just call telling the truth out loud and in public, is present in the hearings in a way that it wouldn't have been, certainly because of the last 4 years and the way we've been seeing social movements happen. And I don't think that we'd see that spirit of protest occurring now in that space that could have been very dry and kind of by the book had these last 4 years not occurred.
So John, let me get your take on this as someone who studies national security and global issues. When you add all of this up, this past 10 days, the hearings. How is the world looking at the United States today?
It's a great question. One of the things the president ran on was, I'm trying to think of the right word for it. It wasn't isolationist, but it was certainly a rejection of the post-World War II security architecture that we had built. And that message, very surprisingly to me, resonated with a lot of Americans. I don't think your average voter in Ohio or Iowa thinks too hard about things like the NATO alliance, which we've taken for granted for 70 years. But one thing that the president did, again, to my great surprise, very effectively, was that he tied that up into that message about America's role in the world, that we're too forward, that we're too out there, and he tied it to economic concerns in places like Iowa and Ohio, where there were issues about and concerns about free trade. And if you talk to, I am by no means an expert in Midwestern economic politics, but if you do go out and you talk to some of the people out there, you talk about things like balance of power in the Pacific and U.S. military power, and their eyes kind of glaze over. But if you talk about things like import tariffs and trade, you have 100 hands shoot up in the air. And so it's unusual to me and surprising to me, but I have a friend who's on the Romney campaign who said, this was all staring us in the face in 2012. We just happened, on the Romney campaign, we happened to be very good at ensuring that more international outlook was the predominant voice, and we lost that after Romney left. So I do think there's legitimacy to it. One thing that both President Obama did and President Bush both did, this is a bipartisan policy and a bipartisan concern that goes back almost 12 years. There's been a great frustration with some of our allies, European allies, that they have not been spending their fair share on defense, contributing enough to our collective defense. They felt like American soldiers were subsidizing their security. That's a much more nuanced debate, and please show up to my study group if you want to get into it. But it is a very real and legitimate concern, and it's not unique to to President Trump. He just happened to be the one who really touched on it and got voters to react on it in a very real way. And I'll close with this. One of the things that gets overlooked, he actually has had a surprise, again, surprising to me, foreign policy success. I believe when you sign the NATO treaty, of all the countries who signed it, there's a requirement that you have to spend 2% of your gross domestic product on defense. That goes back to the original treaty in 1948. And many European countries, I think only 3 of them, Britain, Turkey, and the United States, were actually meeting that 2% threshold. And this is something that really drove the Bush administration and the Obama administration nuts. President Trump came in, and I think through a combination of his words and Secretary Mattis's skillful diplomacy, I think that number is up to 7. You'll have to check me on that for those with Google in the audience. And I think it's scheduled to be up to 10 or 11 in the next 2 or 3 years. So I would certainly take everyone's point that we are in unusual times. We certainly are. But I do think that some of these debates on the international stage can get lost in the contextual framework of not just history, but recent history.
So, Amy, let me get you into this. Margaret makes the good point that all this news of the week, all that we've been talking about, is set in the context of the court, but also in the midterm elections. Right. You've led the Democratic Party, and you've been the executive director of Emily's List, trying to get more women. What should we be thinking about as we look to the midterms, and what are you worried about as a Democrat? What potential do you see? And what's the storyline we're going to see evolving in this semester?
Well, I'm so excited to talk. Let me just say hi, Mom, first, because I think she's live streaming. I had to do that. I am incredibly excited about the potential and what can happen in this midterm. I am optimistic, but I am cautiously optimistic, because I think for so many of us, we've been there where we've gotten close and we haven't, come over the line. So I think that's what we're looking at. I think in the House, the numbers are there. for Democrats. I think when you look at, I think it's like 62 of the 66 Republicans, the seats that are up for play are like lean or a toss-up. We have the opportunity there. I think of all the districts that Hillary Clinton won in 26, congressional districts that are held by Republicans, only 5 are safe seats. So you always look at the numbers, first to see that. So I think that there is an opportunity in the House. I think the Senate is hard. I think the numbers are hard. What we're defending, out of the 35 seats, like 9 are held by Republicans. I think that what we're seeing is that is harder. We need just a net gain of 2 to take back the Senate. So the numbers are there. I think what we have to remember, being someone who's led the party organization in a national election versus a midterm election, in a midterm election, these are more localized campaigns. And I think each one will have individual nuances to that. And I think that we have to look at it from that perspective. And so the resources are played out differently. The conversations might be played differently. But I think the important thing to mention is that I have always been taught and believe that all elections are conversations with voters. And what will change is the technology, how we have that conversation. What change might be the individuals having that conversation or the issues that we're talking about, but it isn't a conversation. What I'm concerned about is that impressions are being formed now. People are getting information now. Candidates are being defined now. So we have to be a part of that conversation now. I'm very excited that all of you are registering to vote. I'm registered to vote. I certainly am encouraging everybody I know to do that. But we also have to be part of the conversation now. We have to be talking about why it matters for us to control the House and Senate from my perspective as a Democrat. But I'm excited to be here also during a midterm because I know what motivates me. And I think I want to spend a lot of time figuring out, with you, what motivates young voters and how you're looking at this perspective. I also know that at the end of this cycle, we will have more women elected than ever before. We're going to do a lot of conversations around Congress, around federal elections, but we are looking at governors' races, state legislatures, local elections. And I know you look all very interested in that, so you can join me Mondays at 4:30 to talk more about that. But I do think the numbers are there for Democrats. I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think the concern for me is the timing. We have to be having that conversation now.
Good pitch. So let's do a lightning round before we get to some questions. Just a quick summary of your study group. Margaret, you're on deadline. Quick summary.
My study group's called The Briefing Room. It's about how President Trump is changing presidential communications, and our gatherings are going to be divided basically into sectors of people in the U.S. and internationally who are on the receiving end of those different styles and how they're learning to recalibrate and respond. The press, CEOs, people inside the White House, foreign leaders, fellow Republicans in Congress. Basically, how you expect presidents to behave is no longer on the table. How is it changing everything in its wake? And I would love to see you guys, and would love your input. And also, I'm trying to lose a lot of weight, so if anyone wants to run with me this semester, email me. Thanks.
It's a multi-purpose description. That's good. That's good. John.
Well, I don't want to understate it, but it will be the greatest study group that Harvard has ever seen by far.
Yep.
Vacations on the French Riviera, field trips to foreign capitals. There's an old Napoleonic diplomat by the name of Karl von Clausewitz. Some of you probably read about him, who said that war is a continuation of politics by other means. And for those of you who are interested in studying foreign policy and interested in studying conflict, and not just war, but I think that's kind of a poor way of looking at it, but also how you sustain peace. You really have to understand political currents, and you have to understand geopolitics in the rawest form of the term. So we're going to get into things like the 2016 Russian active measures in the election. We're going to have one of the most senior American military officers come and talk to us about U.S. nuclear forces and why we have a nuclear deterrent and the reason behind it. And we're going to do some pretty neat workshops as well. So I encourage everybody to sign up. You're going to have fun.
That sounds exciting. I'm coming. Mine is you're going to have three ex-mayors, one that ran the city of Los Angeles, one that ran the city of Philadelphia, and then New Orleans, talk about how to solve real problems in real time that affect real people every day in the neighborhood where you live. And we're going to explore what that really looks like and how governing in America actually happens in cities.
I tried to pitch having my study group be a Sunday night viewing party of Insecure every week, but I was unsuccessful. However, we can still do that. On Tuesdays, 4:30 to 5:45 in the IOP conference room, I think it's L166, we'll be talking about the future of social change. So I co-host a podcast called Pod Save the People on the Crooked Media Network. And every time, hey, thanks, a listener. Every time we do a live show afterwards, I get the same question, is that here's something that I care about and I want to make change. I get that question from teachers, students, lawyers, Hill staffers, parents, children, everybody. And some people think I was born the year Ferguson started, but I had a whole career before then. And my time as a teacher, my time as a Hill staffer, my time as a lobbyist and an advocate, and my time as a nonprofit executive director all fully prepared me and completely left me unprepared to answer that question. It has been the last 4 years that have cemented clarity for me around how to make change happen in a multitude of ways, but in a way that really embraces and centers oneself in the power of the people. And so that is what we will be talking about. That is what we will be working through. Through every session, we'll be doing three things. One, looking at some of the lessons of the last few years and beyond on what people power means. Two, grappling with the tensions of people power, whether or not culture changes politics or politics changes culture, whether you have to work from the outside or the inside or both, whether or not you can have an intersectional and inclusive coalition of people doing the work or not. All of those difficult tensions we'll grapple with. And then third, I'm putting you all to work because we are going to co-create a theory of change and a theory of social change so that we can actually go out there and make our communities the places that we want to live and grow and learn.
Awesome. So mine is titled Finding the Middle Ground, The Art of Governing, subtitled Compromise is Not a Four-Letter Word. And we're going to look at the factors that influence partisanship and bipartisanship. And then the ultimate goal is to inspire as many of the attendees as possible to consider a future in elected office.
And I'll be talking about there are cracks in the glass ceiling, but how do we break it? And I think the interesting part that I really want to get at is talking about women running for office, but talking about women as a voting bloc, talking about women as organizers and running organizations and as activists as well. And I want to encourage everybody to attend. I think we need male and female perspectives on this, but I think that we are only, 20% of the Congress is represented by women and only 7.1% is represented by women of color. So I think that this is such a moment and a time to talk about it. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. What a great lineup. You can see why we're so excited to have our fellows here. So we want to get to questions, but in the audience is Dan Balls, who is a former IOP fellow last fall, and we've asked him to join us this year as a senior fellow. And of course, Dan is the dean of the political press corps, I think it's fair to say. So Dan, what question did we miss? Before we go out to the audience, can I ask you to a microphone to drill into our fellows here and give them a really good, tough question? And then we invite all of you to line up by the microphones. And let's get Dan in on this before we...
I never had the opportunity to be here at the microphone. Mark, I don't think you missed a question. And before I get to that, the one thing I want to say is this is an extraordinary group of fellows who have a range of experiences which are unique and complementary. And tapping into their expertise by going to the study groups, I keep calling them focus groups, going to the study groups, office hours, informal conversations, I guarantee you will be enriching. And for those of you who are first-year students, take advantage of this. You're going to get a lot out of the classrooms, but these fellows, the ones who are here this semester, are a terrific group. So I preface whatever else I say, take that home with you. Mark, I think what was interesting about this whole conversation is that it speaks to the moment. And I would make 3 quick points about it. One is, as the mayor said, we are not in normal times. Whatever side of whatever argument you are on, this is not a normal period. We don't know where it's going. We don't know how it's ending. We don't know what the next chapter is going to be. We do know we're in a moment that we've not been in before, and we're all grappling with it. And in one way or another, everybody on this stage is going to be addressing that in their study groups. I think the second is, and related to that, is that we are in the Trump moment. We have not had a president who so dominates every day, sometimes every hour of every day. He's a master at creating the conversation of the moment, sometimes not in a helpful way to him, but also almost always in a way that keeps the focus on him. That creates anxiety around the country. I mean, as I've been around the country over the last 2 years, I spent a lot of time in and out of the Midwest last year. I've been in suburban areas part of this year. The level of anxiety on the part of all kinds of people is something that I've never seen before. People are worried. People are taking sides. And I think it's because of the dominance of President Trump. So that's the second piece of it. The third is that we are about to come to a moment of decision. We have been living since the election in the unfolding of the Trump presidency and the country's reaction to it. We're going to get the first real referendum on that in 2 months. These midterm elections, however they turn out, will be consequential. There are many people, who are like Amy, who are Democrats, who are optimistic but cautiously optimistic. There are many Republicans who are worried, but who nonetheless recognize that this president has always defied the odds, that whatever you think might happen, he in one way or another seems to scramble that. But come early November, we're going to get a first real reading on how the country feels about this presidency. And again, no matter how it comes out, something is going to be different come November 7th than it is on November 6th. So with that, questions from you all would be welcome.
That's perfect. What a great, that's excellent, Dan. Thank you. And thanks to our fellows here, but let's go to some questions, please.
Hi, my name is Meena Venkataraman, and I'm a sophomore at the college. And my question is about one of the more salient political undercurrents of the summer, which is the burgeoning of the progressive movement, specifically as manifested by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, moving into Andrew Gillum, and as recently as Tuesday, the upset of Ayanna Pressley. And that seems to almost border on democratic socialism, and some critics have said that this is kind of akin to the Tea Party movement of the 2010s. So my question is, to what extent do you believe that this is politically sustainable and this is the right direction of the Democratic Party?
Great question. Amy, can we?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely will start out. I think that there's been some really exciting races on the primary side. And as a Democrat, I think it's good and healthy to have those conversations. I think some of them have certainly been, upsets like you saw in New York, which were, unexpected, and somebody who was new and fresh to the campaign. A lot of these are against people who have been a candidate serving in office for a long period of time. I think what you saw in the Florida governor's race was a lot of this being conversations on the ground and a ground game, and you see that these individuals are really activating and energizing a base. I think some of it is I'm less comfortable with making it about one wing of a party or another wing of a party. I think in the Florida governor's race, as you mentioned, you had an incredible candidate who just worked really hard and talked about the democratic values that he shares. I think he was also, endorsed by Bernie Sanders like a week before the campaign, but had, worked effortlessly, with a lot of effort, on the 2016 race as well. And I think what you saw here in Massachusetts was incredible in that, you know, these districts are changing. The electorate in these districts are changing. So you do have people running who are more representative of the district. I think Ayanna, who I know personally, worked incredibly hard, but she's also had a long history, you know, in the party as well. I think this is all good for the party. I think it's good to have these conversations. I want more diversity, you know, in the party as we go forward. I think the thing that I would also caution is, like, when you saw in the Florida governor's race, the Republican turnout was higher than in the Democratic turnout. So I do think that there's a lot of work to do in these places, but I'm optimistic and excited about some, you know, new faces that'll be heading into the general, especially if they excite the electorate and have more people voting, because we're going to need more people voting in these elections to make sure that we're electing the people who better represent us.
I just want to add really quickly, because this is actually going to be my second study group, not necessarily the conversation about the wings of the party, but about the sustainability of this. Because it's been fascinating to me to watch so many headlines around the three people that you named and others be about shock, right? And just, if you all seen these headlines, it's like, oh my gosh, the biggest upset in the world. I can't believe this happened. But it's like, who are you talking to that this was a surprise to you? I'm actually genuinely want us to grapple with that question, because there is a challenge to traditional polling mechanisms, traditional party structures, traditional understandings of where power sits. This is why I'm talking about redefining power, right? And traditional understandings of where we should make investments, because as soon as we actually saw money going into the ground game of grassroots organizers, people of color, and away from establishment folks who had been Democratic organizers for a long time, we saw these kind of upsets. And so the question around sustainability is really whether or not institutions are willing to evolve enough that they're willing to be intersectional and equitable and welcome voices that have been pounding at the door for a long time and have just now gained entry.
Mitch, did you want to get into this from your travels?
Sure. Let me answer it as an executive that ran a city. We never really thought about partisan politics, and when we were Congress may be a little bit different from this now, but we weren't really ideological in that way. But as you get into national politics, you're now being forced to put jerseys on. You're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're an independent. We are in a time that we do not fully understand. And I'm like you, when I see the media getting all histrionic about what's happening on the Democratic side, I would just note, without getting into a political fight with my Republican friends, that the Republican Party, as we know it, has been decimated, and they're not even having a discussion. And any fight that the Democrats may be having amongst themselves pales in comparison to what Trumpism has done to what we have known as Republican kind of traditional way, and that every 4 years there's always a battle for the quote-unquote soul of the party. I'm really excited what's happening on the Democratic side. I think the more people that are involved, especially younger generations, the more voices. The word socialism scares people in America, and we haven't really had a large conversation about what's the ideological difference between that and social democracies and then mainstream. We're going to have that battle and have that fight. I think it'll be a good one. I think it will manifest itself the way that we do. I will note, however, as a fact, those three individuals that you reference, all exciting, good, young leaders for the country. Simultaneously, there are moderate candidates for Congress who are running on the other side of the party, who are doing extremely well in other parts of the country, which is to say that the country's big and diverse, and that this is not necessarily, quote-unquote, a national movement as much as it is a reflection of what each of those communities demands at any particular time. And I don't think we know yet how it's going to manifest itself through 2018 and 2020. We'll see. I think we have the better side of the argument in 2018. In some of that, it's because independents and Republicans who are not advocates of President Trump believe in the balance of power, and they think that Congress isn't doing its job checking the executive branch, and they want to bring some stability back, and because of in the seats that happen to be up. So some of this is just a matter of fortuitiveness. So in the Senate, the seats that are up, and it just so happens that it's not a good hand for the Democrats in terms of what races are being contested. If we had flipped it and we were 2 years ago or we were 2 years hence, the Democrats would be in a much better position given the environment that we have right now.
Let's go right here.
Hello. Hello. My name is Michael. I'm a sophomore at the college studying government. I have 3 questions for you. I'm sorry. I've heard most of you describe the present White House as unusual, extraordinary, or extraordinarily unusual. Given the sentiment, are you skeptical of the news coming out of the White House? Second, the New York Times op-ed...
From whom?
Just from various news outlets and the president himself, different outlets. The New York Times op-ed provided the perspective that the president is amoral. I'm wondering if you could comment on whether or not binding morals are essential for effective leadership, or does a lack of morals allow for adaptability in leadership? And then third, if you could please comment on the critique coming from the national security community over the anonymity of the informant and the New York Times.
Okay, three big questions here. You've been waiting all summer for those questions. They're good ones. Margaret, how did you react to the skeptical of the news coming out of the White House?
I'm not trying to dodge. I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you skeptical of the veracity of things that the White House says? Or are you saying, are we skeptical of the accuracy of news reporting covering the White House?
I mean, for me personally, I very much believe the news outlets, but there's just so much coming out of them, and it is truly unbelievable, and I'm unable to wrap my head around all of it, to the point that there's starting to grow a level of disbelief, and I'm uncomfortable with that. Well,
I really appreciate the input. I think those of us who cover the White House full-time as a beat struggle with this because setting aside today's anonymous, which is a big deal, or yesterday's, whatever. There are so many leaks from inside the White House, and I'm not talking about national security leaks, I'm talking about political leaks. In my experience, compared to White Houses of both parties in our lifetimes since Nixon, some presidents, like President Clinton, for example, there was a lot more kind of infighting and leaky stuff. Bush, not so much. Obama had a very tight circle. There might be 2 divergent camps on interventionism versus non-interventionism in foreign policy, but for the most part, the people who worked for President Obama were like true believers, pretty loyal to him, no drama Obama. So inside this White House, from the starting gun, there have always been multiple 4 or 5 different columns of power, loyalties, backgrounds, competing interests. You saw a little bit of a leveling off after Steve Bannon's departure and Reince Priebus's replacement. John Kelly was supposed to impose order. Everybody was on board. Everybody understood that things were too hot and they needed to govern, and it's time to tamp down on that. But over the course of the past year, and it's only been a year since all that happened, a lot of that has become unspooled. And so there are so many anonymous sources who are available to reporters. And I think everyone in this room knows this, but this was a revelation to me. A lot of the American public doesn't know that the term anonymous source does not mean that the news organization that is quoting them does not know their identity, okay? If you were an anonymous source, the news organization, every major reputable news organization has a set of rules and procedures and vetting for an anonymous source. The reporter knows who there are, probably 2 or 3 editors up the chain, including the editor-in-chief or the top editor in the bureau knows who they are. You have a discussion about what is their interest. Why do they not want to be quoted? Are we being used? Yes, the answer is yes, you're being used. Why are we being used? To what end? What's their motive? Do they know what they're talking about? Are they in a position to speak this way? So every time you read an anonymous source in a major mainstream news organization, that's the discussion behind the scenes that has happened. But there's such a ubiquity of it, and it's coming from so many different directions. And then there are also these kind of side issues like a bit of a campaign to smoke out leakers by sending false information around to see if anybody leaks it. So maybe the person you're talking to is reputable, but they don't actually know they're being set up. Or these kind of other campaigns to lure reporters into doing a story that isn't true to prove that you can't trust reporters. That it has become filled with landmines to do this kind of reporting. And that's just every day. That's not this. This thing that has happened takes it, to a whole new level, because we all know that in order for the New York Times to have granted, for the New York Times op-ed page to have granted anonymity to this person, they are a person of very senior level who's in a position to know what they're talking about. So I think you're asking a good question. I'm not sure if I know the answer, but I think it's a different calculation than it has been in past White Houses, because there are so many different columns of power, so many different goals that exist parallel to the idea of supporting the president.
Joe, maybe we could bundle the second and third question in terms of the NSC and the, or
I want
Mitch?
to take a crack. We can't solve this here, but I do want to point to your second question that I think almost could be a whole study group.
Okay.
It goes to the issue of honesty, integrity. Yeah. Is it a virtue? Is it a vice? Is it a strength or a weakness? Machiavelli would say that, you should purposefully mislead. There's a whole set of theories around that. I think generally most people think that some of us or all of us at some point in time will make a mistake and tell a mistruth. And you'd say, well, maybe I should have done that, maybe I shouldn't. That's different from using it as a weapon and as a strategy and saying, is that the appropriate way to govern, and does that make sense? And that's really worth thinking a lot about, because that thing, all these norms now are being challenged. Things that you thought we were planning in the premise, that's all being changed now. The president's been abundant. I mean, he's been really clear about this. He doesn't value the truth in any iteration, and it's okay to mislead, and it's okay to strategize in that way. And there's an argument now being made that, as a political weapon, it's actually a good thing to do. You should think about that. And you should ask yourselves whether or not that really works, or whether there's some rules of engagement that will help us become a better society over time. Some people think those conversations are naive. I think they're important. And I think that it really is, there's not an easy answer to that. I think most of us would answer that it's better to tell the truth than not the truth. And you should do that most of the time. And when you don't, and you recognize it, unless there's a national security matter, a presence, that it's better for us all to try to adhere to that rather than to just say there are no rules as it relates to truth, because there is truth. Let's just be clear about that. There is truth. And maybe some of it's relative sometimes, and maybe it's not always absolute. Maybe it's black and white and there are things to discern. But there is truth, and there are facts, and they do matter, and they do have consequences, and it's important to speak, to those general governing principles of governing and living as you go forward.
I want to make sure we get a lot of questions in here, so I'm going to jump right up here.
Hey, thank you all. My name's David Lazarus. I am a graduate student at the Kennedy School of Government. I know a lot of the conversation has been about really, I guess, living in the moment, but I guess my question deviates from that, and like, what molded you in the past? So, former alumni John McCain passed from the Naval Academy, and one thing that they really push on us is values. So I guess this question is more geared towards Congressman Heck and Mayor Landrieu. I guess, what event in your life really molded or influenced the value you have today?
So for me personally, it was a period in my childhood where my father was out of work for a prolonged period of time. He was a supermarket manager, was shot in a hold-up attempt, and was out of work for several years, which fundamentally changed the makeup of my family. Mom had to go back to work, no longer a homemaker, dad recovering. And it was at a point where we had to avail ourselves of government services to survive until our family could get back on track. And so, understanding that there is always a need for a helping hand. A lot of people say that government should function more like a business. I don't agree with that, because there are certain fundamental things that government has to do that businesses don't have to do. And so for those that say, it was kind of an enlightening moment for me to realize that, while I may not have thought of it prior to actually requiring the services within my family, that I sure was glad those services were there. And then I wanted to make sure, as I started on a long career of public service in so many different ways, that I made sure that the helping hand was there for others when they needed it.
For me, it wasn't a singular event. I have eight brothers and sisters, and a mother and father that just really kind of always taught us to find a way to help other people and to use whatever God-given gifts you had to take you there. I know that you serve in the military, and thank you for your service. And you've chosen to serve your country that way. It was just kind of an ethos of, of our family to serve in a way that you thought was helpful. I have brothers and sisters that are not in government that serve civically, but they're always trying to help somebody else. And as a general rule, the attitude was, when there's a problem, go fix it. When there's something to say, say it. When there's somebody to be helped, try to figure out a way to help them. And when there's a catastrophic event like a Katrina, which all really, the cataclysmic event that really, in New Orleans, your life is before Katrina and after Katrina, you have to run to the fire and help people who are in need, because that's kind of what we do. And it was just something that, I was blessed, from my mother and father with just kind of believing that at a very early age.
We all had dinner the other night, and I asked, knowing, of course, of Mayor Landrieu's family, I said, from your father and parents on, from 1960 till you left the mayor's office, how many years of service has the Landrieu family given to the public, with his sister and his treasurer? And the answer is 113 years. It's a remarkable legacy of public service.
Really old, don't I?
I know. Okay, let's go right up here.
I'm Juan. I'm a freshman in the college. Mayor Landrieu, you touched on how that we should not believe that this is the norm in our country. However, what would you say to young people when we see the legislative branch just kind of abdicating their responsibility to oversee and to rein in the executive branch, knowing that many of the members of the legislative branch will remain in office, even if control of Congress switches to a different party?
That's not a fait accompli. They stand for election. And this is just a very strong opinion about this. Congress is not doing its job. We have 3 branches of government. It's designed so that if the executive of either party really gets out of the way, they're supposed to find a way to check and balance. You learn that in 5th grade. And that this Congress is not doing that. And I think the American people are going to change that. I don't think it's necessarily because the American people are so pro-Democrat. They believe in reason and balance, and they think we're out of balance. And then 2 years from now, when another third of Congress is up, if they have not corrected themselves, or if, let's say, the Democrats, should take over, and then they don't do the right thing. But here's the thing. You have got to, the one moment is you have got to go out and vote. People have got to show up. If you don't register, if you don't go out and vote, if you don't work, it will not turn itself. It requires constant churning and constant vigilance. So I would say to your generation, who's not in a normal time, to basically step up to the plate, because it's yours, and you have power, and you can exercise it, and you actually can change. It does matter when you show up and you go to community hearings, or you go to school board meetings, you go to city councils, you offer yourself for office, you advocate. It matters all of the time. And I would just encourage people, if elected officials don't do what you want, throw them out and replace them with other folks.
Thank you. Let's go right here.
Hi, I'm not sure who would like to answer this question, but just regarding the practice of forbearance, especially in these times, how can we, I suppose, practice it ethically? I mean, President Obama waited for Scott Brown to be seated, and all sorts of things along those lines, while the other side was just kind of, screaming and kicking. How can we justify for the practice of forbearance, especially when it's not being practiced on the other side, especially when lives or issues seem to be at stake?
Who wants to take that one? It's a good one. Amy, how do you?
Oh, no, the Congressman, I defer to answer that
In the spirit of bipartisanship.
No, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't. I think it's a really challenging question. I think it's one that we, each administration is handling this in a different way. And to what Mitch said, I think we have to hold. It's not enough to just elect people to office. They have to be held accountable when they're there. So it's a representative democracy. We get to decide who represents us, but then how we hold them accountable. I think it's a great question. I think it's one that we have to kind of really think through. I don't know if anybody else has a.
Joe, did you want to jump in?
Might have stumped the panel. I don't know.
I would agree. I mean, it is a very difficult question, and we've seen it from both sides in the previous administration and this administration. I would agree with Amy that it's an issue that does require much more thought and attention, which it has not had to date.
Let's go right here.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you very much for your time. My name is Jackson Miller, first-year student at the Kennedy School here. This question is for Mayor Landrieu as well as Ms. Packnett.
So I'm call me Brittany.
Oh, Brittany. Sounds great. I'll defer to that. But so I'm a proud native of Richmond, Virginia. And Mayor Landrieu, as you're probably aware, Richmond in this moment is going through a lot of similar reckoning processes with its Confederate legacies across its cityscapes, as well as the legacies of various derogatory and discriminatory policies across all walks of life. With that said, 2019, as we go into next year, past the midterms, that's going to be a watershed moment for this country because it's obviously it marks 400 years since enslaved Africans came to British North America in 1619 to Jamestown, Virginia, just a few miles down the road from where I'm from. And so what we've been doing in Richmond is we've been trying to build several partnership frameworks between the city of Richmond, leveraging that initiative of urban governance, but with places and spaces in West Africa, precisely where the first enslaved Africans actually came to populate certain areas in the South. Mm-hmm. Now, as you build these intersectional cohorts, that requires a constant repositioning and an interrogation of one's own privilege. And in fact, my decision to come here in the midst of that work was challenged repeatedly, and there's justification to that challenge. With that said, from your activism, and it's really refreshing to come into this space and be welcomed into a student body that is very proactive about having those conversations about what the privilege of this place means when you're in the midst of that work. How do you reconcile the privilege that comes with your gender, your race, as well as the platform that you stand on at a place like Harvard when you're trying to build a new revisioning of this history that doesn't look like you?
You want me to answer that? Or you
that was a whole question.
that might be the
sure.
second book, actually.
I mean,
the next book.
I appreciate this question because before I said yes to this, I researched Harvard's work on reckoning with its own history and connection to the enslavement of African people. And despite how awesome this opportunity is, I knew, if given my own values, I could not say yes had that reckoning not at least begun. And so I was glad to see that it has begun, right? I've seen the plaque where the 4 names are and know of some of the things that are moving forward. And so, I mean, obviously the privilege question is a little bit different for the both of us, although I clearly enjoy privileges, right? Like I am here, I am temporarily able-bodied, right? I am cisgender, I am straight, I am a Christian. There are legitimate social privileges that I enjoy, even though I am young, black, and female. But to your question, decided to leverage this privilege as an opportunity for waymaking, and which is how I encourage you to think about it. Because I recently have done some activism work in Saraland, Alabama. So Saraland, Alabama was the scene of a young woman who is now like a little sister to me named Shakisha Clemens, who was thrown down on the floor of a Waffle House after she asked for the corporate phone number. Saraland, Alabama is right next to a place called Africatown. If you don't know this, you should go and read Zora Neale Hurston's new book, Barracoon, which talks all about essentially the last enslaved African. He is buried at Africatown. Saraland is right next to Africatown. I drove over to Africatown. I went to this burial plot where Kazula and all of these enslaved folks who came over on this last ship are buried, along with generations of their families. And I felt a deep sense of responsibility in that moment around waymaking. Because the opportunities and the privileges and the resources that you are given are not meant to be absorbed only. Audre Lorde said that, right? She said the gravest error of privilege is to absorb without use. So the question is not whether or not you should take advantage of privileges. The question is what you do with them when you do take advantage of them. No one can change the race that they were born. Maybe Rachel Dolezal thinks she can, but that's another conversation. Right? There are privileges that we are born into in a lot of ways, and the guilt that people associate with those privileges is not useful. Right? And this is not just for you, it's for everybody. That guilt is not useful. How were you actually going to leverage the privilege to make way for other people? I said yes to this because I wanted to make way for people. Yeah.
That was a very insightful, excellent answer. And mine would be very, very similar to that without being trite. To whom much is given, much is required. So, the issue around this we've never really had a good conversation in this country about race because we don't know how to talk to each other about it. And I've said many times that, on my experience growing up as a white man in the Deep South was different in a lot of ways than a lot of other white guys. It wasn't, I wrote this book and many people came to me. I'll just give you one little anecdote. I went to an mostly all white high school, and my friends would come to my house and they would say, why do you live in a black neighborhood? And I would go, I don't live in a black neighborhood. And they go, yes, you do. There's a black person that lives down the street. It's my friend Reggie. And I'm like, okay, well, that means everybody else that lives here is white. So why do you think I live in an African-American neighborhood? And their view of the world, because they had lived in suburbia, not in an urban setting, was that when there was one African-American neighborhood was black, which is interesting because historically, if they wanted to hang you in the South, if you had 1/32nd ounce of blood, then you were all black. And so this conversation about race for people made them very uncomfortable. We have never really, like they tried to do in South Africa, like they tried to do in Germany with the Holocaust, have actually developed, and this is what I love this, a way for us to really have this conversation. It occurs to me that white people, Caucasians, have to recognize that they were privileged. But that doesn't mean now you're frozen, now that you don't have a right for anything, but you do have an obligation to be open, to listen, to care for. And when an African American, for example, comes to you, and you're the mayor of the city, and says, that Confederate statute really bothers me, you don't say, well, get over it. You don't say, well, why it's always been there, which is not true. It hasn't always been there. That's a lie. It was just a lie. It hasn't always been there. So you say to yourself, interesting. So the way it happened with me, without going through the whole history, is that we were rebuilding the city of New Orleans after Katrina. 500,000 homes hurt, 1,800 people killed. I mean, we were physically rebuilding the schools and everything, and the issue of the physical space and whether it reflected the soul of the city came up as we prepared for the 300th anniversary. And my good friend, Wynton Marsalis, who some of you may or may not know, but he's maybe the world's greatest musician, great trumpeter, and a great historian, said to me, because I asked him to help me, I said, man, I need you to help me, curate the 300th anniversary. He goes, well, I need you to do something for me. And he asked me this just easy little thing. We take down to Robert E. Lee. And I'm like, well, why? And he said, well, this is what he said, as a friend, not as a great historian. He said to me, who I grew up with him, he said, have you ever thought about that from my perspective? And how every time I walk by there, I feel less than. Did you know Louis Armstrong left because of that? And then, of course, it hit me, because I was not an unknowing person, about the great diaspora and all of the African Americans that left the South and the intellectual capital that left us. It tweaked my conscience, as it should. And then I started thinking about a way to have a conversation to bring people to a reconciling place. Mm-hmm. And reconciliation is important, but essentially reconciliation is hard if someone doesn't say, I'm sorry, which means you recognize something bad happened, whether you participated in it or not. I'm sorry. And the other person has to then say, this is the way, and I forgive you. And we have that conversation we have to have it across history, because slavery was this nation's great original sin that we have never really worked through, the consequences of which exist today. And so It just got to the point where I thought that the presence of those monuments in places of reverence, not remembrance, reverence, were not truthful about who they were and what we were, and I wanted to course correct an error, and I had the responsibility, because I was the mayor, to do it. I could have walked away from it. I could have figured out, well, that's not me, but then I figured out that I really couldn't, because I couldn't explain to my family and friends that since that was mine and now I knew the truth, that I wouldn't take action, and I would felt that history would have condemned me if I did it. And I'm finding now that as this conversation opens itself up in places like Richmond and other places, this conversation has to be different in every place, but it is a purposeful conversation that requires a resolution, that hears other people, sees other people, understands them, and then tells the truth about our whole history, because when we know our whole history, we're better, and not just some of it.
Thank you guys. And just real quick, if anyone's interested in learning more, talk to me afterwards, or we'll be meeting up at Black Sheep Bagel Cafe on Sunday, 11 a.m. So thank you guys.
Well done.
Thanks.
All right.
Hi, my name is Chloe. I am a first year at the college. And my question is primarily for the women on the panel, although I guess anyone could answer if you feel so moved. So recently, with the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings that are going on, there's been a lot of discussion among his supporters, particularly, but not limited to, his pro-life supporters, about the way that pro-choice advocates are talking about the confirmation hearings. Specifically, I'm thinking of Senator Ben Sass's statement a couple of days ago that used the word hysteria, which is a gendered term, 3 times. And so I guess my question is, from a strategic perspective going forward, do you think that there needs to be a shift in the way that pro-choice advocates talk about reproductive rights, or do you think that we should be ignoring those critiques and proceeding with our current strategy?
That's a good question. I think it's a great question, and I think that that's why there is so much emphasis being put on the importance of this Supreme Court nomination. For a lot of people. I mean, there's the choice aspect, there's voter rights, there's different parts of this nomination that have different groups very concerned. I'm concerned as a woman, from a women's health perspective, as a woman who should be able to make her own choices. I don't think I should have to change the dialogue about why that's important to me. And that's why I think it's really important when I see a Senator, Kamala Harris talk about and question this, and why it's important to have women in those, arenas and asking those questions. I think one of the most compelling things is when she, asked the judge about whether or not he knew of any, legislation that was prohibitive on men's health. And so to me, I believe in the protests, a lot of the organizations that are really strongly speaking about this. I have friends working there I've been supportive of. I don't think we should have to change the conversation for something that's that important. People question tactics also about what we're going to do here. There are only 3 women on the court right now. When these decisions come up, they affect us all, not only in the short term, but in the long term. And so I'm going to support and champion and use my voice every day with those organizations that are having that conversation, and I think we should be able to have it in that context, and I don't think we should have to change it. I feel strongly about that. So
this is a really great question, in part because that is another one of my study groups about that. We were actually having this conversation about tactics, right, and about what is acceptable protest look like? Is there acceptable protest? What is the line? But I also was on the road for 2.5 weeks on a tour called Rise Up for Roe. We were literally going around the country, and we were like, no, be hysterical, please. This is actually very serious, and we need you to take it seriously. That said, I am also a person of faith, and so I know that having this conversation with certain people in my life who share my faith background, I often end up using the phrase bodily autonomy, because I'm often talking to Black women who have a different understanding and relationship to what it means to not have control over your body versus talking about abortion. At the same time, 1 in 4 women by the time they're 45 will have had an abortion. Somebody who has had an abortion, right? So we should be talking about it like the common medical procedure that it is, to your point. I am a believer in a multitude of tactics. I just believe that it is strategically more effective. And I believe in not shaming the people for the tactic that they choose. And so if that means that you want to get dressed up like the Handmaid's Tale and go stand silently outside of the judiciary, then that is what you do. Then that is your contribution to the space, because that is going to wake somebody up. If my contribution is to have a conversation about bodily autonomy with the Christian women that I know, to get them to take the same action and call their senator about this confirmation, then that is another tactic. It is not better or worse. It is simply different. And I actually think we disadvantage ourselves, especially in the work of social change, when we limit ourselves to one tactic only.
So I'm just looking at the clock, and I'm afraid we're not going to get to everyone that's here at the question. I'm sure our fellows would stay longer, but why don't we invite you to have the last question.
Hi, good evening. I'm Jamie Lockhart. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Question for Congressman Heck and John. When you're looking at your former colleagues like Congresswoman Barbara Comstock or Congressman Steve Knight or Congressman Scott Taylor, who are in these toss-up districts where President Trump is very unpopular, what advice would you give them, and how much do you think they should separate themselves from President Trump?
Yeah, that's a great question, because my district was one of those districts. My district was a toss-up district. It was a almost 50-50 district. It was a little bit left-leaning district. I think it goes back to the old adage that all politics is local, and while the Democrats are going to try to nationalize this election and tie every Republican to the president, they need to concentrate on the issues that are important to their constituents and keep their campaign local. Going to what Mayor Landrieu said, right? While we're not responsible for filling the potholes at Congress, there are issues that resonate well at the local level that are federal issues, and I would encourage them to concentrate on those issues when they talk to their constituents.
John, did you want to?
Yeah, no, that's obviously I don't have the experience that you do actually running, but I have advised in very similar races. And you're really talking, I think, I really want to foot stomp the importance of the somewhat cliche term that the congressman used, which is all politics is local, all politics is local, all politics is local, all politics is local. And you're talking about three very different districts. Steve Knight is in the northern Los Angeles suburbs. Scott Taylor is down in the Norfolk area of Virginia, and then Barbara Comstock is in the western suburbs of Virginia. And so each of those constituencies have a very different set of needs and desires, and like one state might care more about gun control or Second Amendment rights, however you want to phrase that. Another might care more about taxes. And so I think to the thematic answer to your question, it's a bipartisan answer that goes into the heart of the way every single person in this audience thinks about government, which is, if you're an elected official or you're a citizen, the way that you think and the way that you interact with policy and politics is that you decide what is the best thing for the country, what is the best thing for your neighbors, and you act accordingly. And if you're a Democrat and that meant voting your conscience against policy of President Obama, so be it. Same thing for Republicans now in this district. Your moral compass really has to be your guiding light. And I say that with humility again, because unlike the mayor, unlike the congressman, I have never had to be responsive to constituents. That is an entirely different perspective, and it's very easy for me to sit here and give advice. But that's a very insightful question. I really appreciate it.
Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. We're so excited for these fellows. For the undergraduates, the IOP is having an open house Wednesday from 7 to 8:30. We remind you of the Harvard Votes Challenge and the opportunity to register to vote. Any last words? Do we miss anything? Any final closing thoughts? Anything left on the table for this group? Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week at the forum.